Hello everyone and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today on what appears to be a potentially stormy weather event, we are going to be touring the little room behind me, Studio Loja Saarinen. And this was the practice, the commercial weaving enterprise of Mrs. Elliott Saarinen's husband, the mother of Pipsan and Eero Saarinen. And she led the weaving workshop here from 1929 until 1942. So I'm trying to keep the door from closing on us. But just to place us within the context of Cranbrook, we are right at the corner of Lone Pine Road and Academy Way. So there's the Academy Administration Building, the original Art Museum and Library, now the studios for 2D or for photography and print media. Here is the dormitory, the original art club, and we are going to be stepping inside momentarily here to the original weaving workshop and weaving showroom of Mrs. Saarinen. And it's part of the larger Arts and Crafts courtyard, which was completed in 1929. It housed the original workshops of Cranbrook, the silversmith studio, the blacksmith forge, the bookbinder, and the cabinet maker. And so just stepping aside here, we can see the original Arts and Crafts studios there. And then Mrs. Saarinen worked with her smaller office here, and then the weaving showroom. So let's step inside. Today, this is the studio of Elliott Earls, who is the artist in residence for the 2D department. Now, we are seeing Elliott's work here, not Loya Saarinen's, and this space is a working artist studio. I always like to say that here at Cranbrook, we pretty much use every building as it was built by the Booths and the Saarinens. And so the only examples of spaces that have changed would be our tennis courts, which are where the new studio building was built, the dining hall, which is now the student lounge, and then Saarinen House, which is now a museum. Other than that, even in historic spaces like Studio Loja Saarinen, we still use them as studios. Now, Mrs. Saarinen began her weaving enterprise in October of 1928. And I'm not actually sure where she and Valberg Norquist were weaving in that first year. This complex was completed in 1929, and her main weaving, the workshop supervisor and the designer, Maya Anderson Virda, arrived in October of 1929. From one room with one loom, she expanded to, at her peak, of sort of 1930 to 1933, she had over 30 looms working. And so this room that I'm standing in was originally it had 3 or 4 looms in it, and then she also displayed rugs here. Eventually, she far outgrew this space. There were looms in the basement, there were looms behind this door, there were even looms across the street. So it really grew into a much larger enterprise. And this is where Mrs. Saarinen would sit and she would talk with her clients about what rugs they wanted. And she really produced quite a bit of work here in the studio. So I've pulled out 2 historic photos, which I think you saw on the Facebook advertisement. So this is a view about 1930. And that is Mrs. Saarinen sitting at her loom. And this is Maya Anderson Virda, who came from the Swedish school, the Hartemansvanet school, the School of Handicraft in Stockholm. Mrs. Virda was slightly older than Loya Saarinen. She was also probably the closest thing to a celebrity hand weaver that there was in the world. These are 2 of the early weavers, Lillian Holm, and I think that's Valborg Nordquist. And they're weaving here on rigid Swedish-style looms. Of course, the Cranbrook loom that we know and love, that is still used by the students, wasn't invented until 1936. So this is an older style, heavier and slightly more difficult to use loom. So if I pan the camera up, this is that exact view. And as we look at this room, I'm going to talk a bit more about Loja Saarinen, and then I'll talk some about Elliott Earls. So at the center of the room, and the great survivor of the space, are these ceiling paintings by the Detroit artist Katherine McEwen. And Katherine Sibley McEwen was a Midwesterner. She and her sister, Alexandra, were both artists. Alexandra was a bookplate designer who also painted and who did theater. Katherine McEwen is probably most famous at Cranbrook for having done the frescoes at Christ Church Cranbrook. So she was a redhead, her sister was a redhead, she painted redhead figures at Christ Church and here at Studio Loja Saarinen. There's also Katherine McEwen paintings in the lower level of the Cranbrook School's dining hall and on the side of Brookside School, and inside Brookside School as well. So these ladies here are they winding the thread, I think? Are they making the bobbin? One or the other. I think this is winding the thread on the bobbin. And so you see the two weavers, and then if I turn my camera around, we can see the collecting the thread. And so here you see the weavers that wonderful sort of whiplash curve coming around, being held in the hands of the weavers. Now, if you want to study these paintings in detail, just do a quick Google search, Cranbrook, Studio Loja Saarinen ceilings. And I have a blog post that I wrote with my colleague Leslie Mayo, and we included high-resolution photos of all of these frescoes. So in the center of the weaving workshop, they're winding the thread on the bobbin and collecting the thread. On the outside, we have the figures who are gathering the materials needed for fiber art. So here we see a woman who is harvesting cotton from the cotton plant. You can see in her hand there that she's gathering the cotton. I'm not sure what she's wearing on her head, sort of classically inspired Art Deco figures. And then next to the cotton plant, you see the little flax plants with the green or with the purple blooms. And so the harvesting of flax, which is used then to make linen. And so our gentleman here is harvesting flax for linen, cotton for cotton, obviously. And then we'll walk to the other end of the room to see our last two allegorical figures of weaving. Here on the left, we see the harvesting of silkworms. And so those are the little silk trees, or I'm not sure what kind of tree they're on. Bushes are trees, but the silkworms who, of course, it's their cocoons that are boiled and then unspooled to gather silk. And so you see she has a tray of silkworm cocoons, and then here she is unwinding the silkworm. And then on the other side, we have a little lamb or sheep for the harvesting of wool. So in the four corners of the room, we have wool, silk, cotton, and linen in all of these wonderful allegories by Katherine McEwen. Mulberry trees. Thank you, Richard. Now, what I really appreciate in having studied Katherine McEwen's work here at Cranbrook, which it is certainly her largest collection of work, I really appreciate these borders. They're a little bit atypical of Katherine McEwen. So she does borders elsewhere on campus, and none of them are quite like this, which is why I sort of argue that she is designing almost weaving. She's sort of doing her painting around the edge of the room as embroidery work, because they have this sort of patterning that can read like stitching going around this light-washed ceiling. Now, the ceiling itself does have the wonderful calcium lime stain that Elliott Saarinen used on the interiors of a number of rooms here at Cranbrook. If you think of how light the wood is over at the Kingswood Dining Hall, this is that same very light stain to get this really bright ceiling. Now, you'll also see that he's using these very wide planks of quarter sawn oak, and you can see that it is quarter sawn because it has that slight wave to the grain. And so it's the same oak that George Booth specified for the use in all of the paneling at Cranbrook House, used again here. It's the sort of most luxurious cut of the oak tree that you can use. Now, these buildings were meant to be teaching tools for the students, and so they are built in very traditional ways. And so they are load-bearing masonry, brick, and stone buildings with then timber roofs and slates on top of that. And so without actually going into archives and finding the section cut of this room, I can't be certain, but I believe that these timbers are actually these structural timbers. I don't think that I don't think there's enough room for this ceiling to be dropped down on the inside in the way that it is on a number of other spots on campus where, for instance, in the dining halls, the Great Barrel Vault is a dropped ceiling. It is suspended from the actual steel structure of the building. This little sort of five-sided open courtyard are the most sort of traditional construction that Elliott Saarinen ever did in America, again with that English arts and crafts attitude of truth to materials, the sort of joy and beauty of labor. And so I believe that that we are looking at the structural system of the construction that has then been painted. Now, I have another photo that I want to show you, which just shows some of the wares of Studio Loja Saarinen, what you could have come to the studio to purchase. So she was advertising in the literature that was made in the next room over, the Cranbrook print shop, that she offered quality, durable, and suitably harmonious color and designs of rugs, hangings, upholstery fabric, and curtains. And so this is a photo that you can see in greater detail over at Cranbrook Archives Content DM Image Database. If you just Google Cranbrook Archives Digital Image, the database can show up and you can pull up all of these historic photographs. But the interesting thing about what she was showing off in the weaving workshop, this is the corner right behind me, the furniture was designed and made for this room by Elliott Saarinen. You'll recognize that it's very similar to the furniture in Saarinen House. Then she's also showing a rug that we still have as part of the Art Museum collection, designed by Maya Anderson Virda for the 1925 World's Fair. This was rewoven here at Cranbrook in 1929. And then on the wall is actually a Swedish rug from the Hannebattensvanner. And so this is sort of the school that Loja Saarinen modeled her weaving workshop on. This is an example of that fine interlocking inlay or Rollakan Swedish weaving. So we don't call these tapestries because tapestry is that is a weave technique. It is not a name of an object. And so Loja Saarinen never produced tapestries here at Cranbrook. She only made hangings. It does get confusing because she then named things tapestries. So the proper name of certain items is Festival of the May Queen Tapestry. But when we publish it, we say Festival of the May Queen Tapestry hanging, because it is technically a hanging, not a tapestry. That's your nerdy fact of the day. The credenza, the sideboard that was in that photo, I have traced it down, I've hunted it down through all of the photos because a lot of furniture in the early days of Cranbrook moves around. It does not, I have not been able to find it. I found it in other photos, but I don't know where it has ended up. The furniture is stored at the Art Museum. The original lighting were these funny little sort of pyramidal lamps that just had a single bulb in them. I also want to show you the fireplace here, which Elliott's musical instruments are sitting in front of, but it has this sort of wonderful Cranbrook stepped back detailing, and then this really monumental mantelpiece of a single piece of limestone going across, and then the decorative brick hearth coming out, and the fireback of decorative brick as well. And then those andirons are part of the Cranbrook collection. Now, along this wall, Mrs. Saarinen kept her yarns. Now, if you've not come to one of my lectures about Studio Loja Saarinen and how it operated, it was a commercial weaving enterprise. So she was head of the weaving and textile department, but she actually called those students her hobby weavers because she was actually most dedicated to overseeing the commercial production of rugs, hangings, upholstery, curtains, dress fabric. She was much more interested in selling that and running this as a design enterprise and business. She was not as interested in teaching. But to do that, she was actually paid a salary, and then she had to operate the studio on her own. So there's many letters and archives of these contract disputes about, who's paying the snow plowing, who's paying the heating, who's paying for firewood, who's paying for material. She herself paid for the material, and when she closed the studio in 1942, she then sold that material to Cranbrook. And so she had quite an enormous store of yarns and dyes and weaving samples that were kept in a room through this middle door. There's now student studios back there. And then she had her other yarns and things in these built-in cabinets. If you have questions about Studio Loja Saarinen, do type them in. It's something I talk about quite a bit. And there is an hour-long lecture that I gave that we are still selling tickets to. So if you'd like to watch me talk about Studio Loja Saarinen with a lot more historic information and historic images, you can send us a message and we can let you know how to sign up for that talk. Now, before I step out and head over briefly to Saarinen House to show us some of the weavings of Studio Loja Saarinen, because there's obviously none in the room now, I wanted to just say a bit about Elliott Earls, because first I want to thank Mr. Earls for letting us invade his space today. This is his studio. Elliott has been the head of the Department of 2D Design, so graphic design, since 2001. He's from Cincinnati. He studied at Rochester Institute of Technology in their Brick City campus, designed by former Eero Saarinen's architect's associate, Kevin Roach. So he studied at Rochester Institute of Technology, and then he came to Cranbrook, and he graduated from the design department in 1993. Between 93 and taking over as head of the department in 2001, he worked in New York and in New Canaan for different graphic designers. He also set up his practice as a performance artist and as a one-man band. And today, Elliott's practice is really divided across the design disciplines. So he works in nonlinear video, in spoken word poetry, in music, and in design. And I encourage you to check out his YouTube channel, Studio Practice, where you can learn all about his philosophies of design, and you can see some of these nonlinear video pieces. I'll just talk, and I am not an Elliott Earls expert, and so I can only tell you what I gleaned from the artist before he popped out at 5 o'clock, which these are some screen prints that he does himself. He does about one a month, and they are sold to help raise his practice and his family. And he starts with three-dimensional shapes, and so he does these artist proofs of a character Anubis, named after the Egyptian god. And then Anubis sort of exists in all of these different manipulated forms. And then you can see that Anubis has been rendered here as a screen print, as the Cyclops. And so these are a number of his different sculptures. I'm not actually sure if they're all called Anubis. I shouldn't have said that. But we see a different sort of milling and 3D printing techniques that are then transformed into digital objects, also transformed into paintings, into screen prints. Here's the sculpture who I know the proper name is Anubis. I'm sort of in love with Anubis and want them to be on campus with the Carl Millis bronzes. And so you can see that his practice really goes across medium and across sort of disciplines between performance art, video, and then all of these objects that we see sitting about the artist studio. It's always exciting to be in an artist studio and see what they're working on. As I was preparing for today, I really enjoyed Elliott's proposal of how we understand art, the ADSR theory of art viewing: attack, decay, sustain, and release. And when you attack the work, that's the first 1/1000th of a second experiencing it. So that's your initial sort of exposure to the art piece. And I'm probably going to botch his theory. So go and watch YouTube Studio Practice episode 30, and you'll get the full ADSR theory. Once we've attacked the work in 1/1000th of a second, then it starts to decay, and that is when we begin to process the piece, when we engage with it in this sort of cognitive recognition of the piece. The sustaining aspect is its ability to engage our intellectual, emotional, and phenomenological sort of processes. So do we have a reaction? Do we have an experience with the piece? And then the release is that moment when you leave the piece. And so as soon as you stop looking at it, you've released the piece. And how does it then remain in your mind? How does it continue to affect you or change you? And so the best art should always attack, decay, sustain, and release you as you experience it. I think it reflects Elliott's extraordinarily experimental view of work and of practice. He's been called a grunge graphic designer in the 90s, and I think today he still is very much on the cutting edge of graphic design and practice. So I encourage you to go and check out, now that you've seen a little glimpse of his studio, to learn a bit more about his practice. Of course, the students here at Cranbrook are really engaged in his department with writing, criticism, production, and he really encourages his students to be experimental. Now, I think Elliott does have the single best studio on campus, and he does look out over Lone Pine Road, so this is the intersection of Lone Pine. Feel free to ask questions as I head out of the studio. It has been a long-awaited dream, I know, for many of you to see inside of Studio Loja Saarinen. I think it is exciting that it remains a place of practicing art, of not just a historic room. Behind it, these are where the other looms for Studio Loja Saarinen were, and then the power loom where commercial fabrics could be woven was downstairs by 1937. It was part of the 1933 World's Fair, and then it came to Cranbrook and was used by Studio Loja Saarinen, and then the students well into, I think, the 90s. So now those are the departments of 2D design, so Elliott's students are in the studios there. I thought it would be fun for us to head over to Saarinen House just to see a bit more of Loja Saarinen's work. So let me make sure I have locked his studio. He does have in Loja Saarinen's office, he keeps the 3D printer and the other material that he uses to produce some of his artwork. So from the outside, Studio Loja Saarinen looks like this charming English cottage. And so you have the stone bay windows within the brick chimney and the stone chicken up on top. And I always picture Mrs. Saarinen sitting in her office with her quiver of arrows. After Mrs. Saarinen retired, we bricked up her little arrow slit. That is, of course, not true, but it does show Elliott Saarinen's mastery of masonry, where you see that he's fit sort of 4 rows of Roman brick within the 2 rows of common brick, and then he's pushed and pulled bricks in order to create shadow lines. So when the sun hits this building, you begin to get these sort of larger patterns within the brickwork, and then in the winter, like a Japanese garden, he's designed these to catch snow. And so on snowy days, you come by, and instead of just seeing a blank brick wall with snow below, you start to see lines of snow sitting on the actual brick facade. So Mrs. Saarinen came to work every day here in Studio Loja Saarinen, which was, of course, attached to the other artistic disciplines. So the print shop was in the corner, the silversmith, the cabinet maker. By 1933, she had enough weavers that she also had an annex here with more looms, and then she also kept a showroom in that building, which is where she showed off her larger rugs. Here in what we call Dorm 1, which was called the Art Club, Mrs. Virde lived here. I believe she was in the corner room, Mrs. Virde, as the most senior artist. She had a 2-room apartment next to Marshall Fredericks, who lived right there. And then the other weavers lived off and on in the art club, but many of them took up residence in Pontiac or other nearby towns. And then, of course, Loya Saarinen got to work every day from Saarinen House. And we'll just step inside here for a minute. It would be inappropriate for me to do a Studio Loja Saarinen tour and not actually show you any Loya Saarinen rugs. Hello, hopefully we've reconnected now, just to be able to see a few of the products from the studio, including Cranbrook rug number 3, which is a hanging, has been pretty severely faded by the years, but it is a Islamic style prayer rug with a tree of life motif at the center. And then, of course, all of the raya rugs that are used for the carpet on the floor, as well as the bench raya seating element. And this is a rug that we attribute to the design to Elliott and Loya Saarinen with its great stepped pyramid motif. And at the corner of these rugs, because they were woven for Cranbrook, for the president's residence, Saarinen House, they do have the Cranbrook Cranbrook Academy of Art logo, which we attribute the design to Elliott Saarinen. So all of these rugs are hand knotted. And so what you're looking at here are the individual knots of her Swedish weavers. Mrs. Saarinen did not sit and weave all day. She was running it like a industrial design studio. So she was designing the pieces. She was managing the inventory. She was getting commissions. She was sort of hiring weavers and running the production, but she did not sit at the loom. Her weavers could sit, for a piece like this was maybe 2 or 3 weavers at the loom. For a larger rug, she could get up to 5 weavers sitting across at a 12-foot loom. And so a piece like this, which is 11.5 by 24 feet long, this would have taken 5 weavers working every day, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., probably 5 months or so in order to hand knot this rug. And of course, this is the original rug. This is a rug that Loya Saarinen produced in about 1930 for exhibition. It traveled around the country as an example of Cranbrook art and of Studio Loja Saarinen. But also in Saarinen House, we display reproductions of her original curtains. And so this is material that was woven on Cranbrook looms by Cranbrook graduates in the 1990s for the house. And then the most famous of the Saarinen's seating forms, because it is so unusual to our Anglo-American eyes, is the bench raya, which is a late 19th century Finnish sort of romantic view of seating furniture, where instead of using animal pelts running from the bench to the floor, they would use these decorative, often narrative raya weaving, so traditional Finnish weavings, and run them across the cushions directly onto the floor. It's something the Saarinens were designing by the 1890s, in which they continued well into the 1930s here at Cranbrook. And you see that we have the shaggy bench raya and then the closely cropped bench raya as well. Now, as we conclude our lecture here today, I will end with an image of Mrs. Saarinen herself. So this is a portrait of Loya Saarinen painted in 1922 by Elliott Saarinen. Of course, he studied painting in Helsinki in the 1880s, and he painted a portrait in 1920 that looks like the 1880s. He studied painting and architecture, one the passion of a warm heart, the other the product of a cool mind, in his own terms. Sally, your question, the containers are by Russell Wright, the great New York industrial designer, some of the very first commercially available spun aluminum products. And Russell Wright is actually a great example of the type of designer that Loya Saarinen was, where Russell Wright was a prolific designer, but he had an enormous team beneath him. But every product is a Russell Wright product. And so it really is, that is the sort of model of the studio that Loya Saarinen used as well, where everything is a Loya Saarinen product, but nothing is actually made by the hand of Loya Saarinen, or very few things are. Now, before I let you go, I want to remind you all of this Sunday's lecture. At 3 p.m. Eastern, we will be joined by Valerie Belent, who is the head of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Historic Artist Home and Studios program. It is a relatively new program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. There were 44 houses and studios that were involved until February 11th, when Cranbrook's Saarinen House became the newest class of historic artist homes and studios. I did a lot of work in the fall on the application. It was a huge project, the most involved application I've ever been a part of. Very dedicated board they have, asking very specific questions. And we were able to join this unique coalition of the National Trust, not because of Elliott Saarinen as an architect, because they don't actually accept architects into the historic artist homes and studios. They only accept artists. And so we were accepted because Loya Saarinen worked here. And so I have historic photos showing some of her designs here in this room, showing some of her hangings and her sketches. I also know that she worked on a hand loom in the book room here at the house, and she even had a loom upstairs. But of course, we really were able to join the program because of Cranbrook's sort of commune-like atmosphere, where she had her weaving workshop, she had her weaving room alongside the house. That's why I asked Elliott for us to be able to go into his studio today in advance of Sunday's talk. Now, Valerie is not going to give a lecture about Saarinen House. She is going to talk about the other 47 artist homes and studios. So I encourage all of you to head over to center.cranbrook.edu and purchase your ticket for Sunday's talk. It's going to be a really excellent journey from Olana to the Russell Wright Home and Studio, which is part of the organization. Olana is Frederick Church's house. We'll go to Thomas Cole's house, N.C. Wyeth's house, Georgia O'Keeffe's Home and Studio. It really goes around the country between all different types of artists, and the center could not be more thrilled that Loya Saarinen's Home and Studio is now going to be part of this National Trust for Historic Places program. We are, of course, a National Historic Landmark, but it's always nice to be recognized as part of a new community of curators and directors and registrars who are working on preserving the unique legacy of American artists. Also, another plug, just 2 weeks after that, on March 28th, I will be giving another lecture about contemporary artist, Cranbrook Academy of Art artists who are creating work and placing them here within the Saarinen House, the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House, and Cranbrook House. I'm going to talk more about that on next week's Live at 5, but do keep on your calendar Sunday, March 28th at 3 p.m. for a lecture about that student show called Speculative Histories. Thanks so much for joining us as we went on this thrilling tour through Studio Loja Saarinen, the studio of Elliott Earls, and ending here among the beautiful, harmonious textiles of Saarinen House. Until next Wednesday, I'm Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. Hopefully I'll see you at the lecture on Sunday. If not, I'll be back here for another Live at 5 next Wednesday at 5 p.m.